So today, what I want to do is finish up talking about modern growth and then go back and think about reasons for why the onset of modern growth would be delayed through 100,000 years of human history. Okay? And the crucial thing that we saw was that there can only be one source of modern growth. Right? At the surface level, there appear to be two things that matter: increased accumulation of capital, physical and human, and also an improved efficiency of the economy. But those two things are so tightly connected that either it's all got to be going through capital, or it's all got to be going through efficiency, or there's got to be some other third mysterious variable that's pushing everything. And I've explained to you the economists have to bet that it's all capital, or else economics is an irrelevant subject, right? It's basically, like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic is the role of economics, because the thing that's moving the ship along is something that will fall outside the realm of economics. Okay? And so I explained the idea of essentially widening the definition of capital, and then you have to add these very important externalities that are associated with capital, but we went through all the difficulties in locating these externalities, and so that path has been unfruitful so far. The problem is even deeper for economics, because you can make very strong arguments that most of capital accumulation since 1800 is actually simply a product of the increased efficiency of the economy. That efficiency is not only explaining 3/4 of all growth at an immediate level, it actually explains all growth since the Industrial Revolution. And I was explaining last time how that happens. And so we have to go through a little bit of mathematics here, but once we're through, then we're into the promised land, okay? So that here we have the amount of physical capital per person in the economy, and here we have the amount of output per person. And then there's going to be a connection between these two for any given technology in the economy. And that's actually called the production function. Okay? And the one key element of this is that output always goes up, output per person, as you add more capital per person, but it increases at a declining rate. Right? And so there's a diminishing marginal product of capital. If you learned anything from Economics 1, that's the one key important piece of economic information. And what will then happen is that society has to decide how much capital to invest, so the initial capital stock, and that's going to be determined by the point here where the slope of this curve, which is the marginal product of capital, it's the amount of extra output you get for another unit of capital. It's where that marginal product equals the real return on capital, right? And so the key condition in the economy is that the real return has to equal the marginal product of capital. Okay? And so we go on investing in housing till the point where the rent of housing divided by the price of housing is roughly equal to the interest rates that people have to pay on mortgages, right? That's what determines how big the housing stock is in the economy, and it's all the way through the economy. There's these similar relationships that are going to hold. Okay? So what happens then if there's some exogenous source of efficiency advance in the economy? What will happen is that this production function will move up at all levels of capital. When that happens, this slope has to become steeper at the existing stock of capital. Okay? And so after the Industrial Revolution, as efficiency began to advance in economies, at the existing stock of capital, now the marginal product of capital has actually increased. Now, what could have happened on the other side of the equation is that the return of capital could have actually increased as well, and you wouldn't have invested in any more capital. But an interesting thing is that since the Industrial Revolution, the return on capital in modern economies has stayed roughly the same. The long-term rate of return on safe assets is about 3%. That rate of return was almost achieved by the time of the Industrial Revolution, and so as a kind of a rough constant in the modern world is that the return on capital really hasn't changed that much since the Industrial Revolution. This thing seems to be a constant. Consequently, whenever there's an efficiency increase in the economy, now you're at a point where at the existing capital stock, the return is higher than the cost of the capital measured by the real interest rate. And so consequently, any improvement in efficiency will actually induce further capital accumulation in economies. And a lot of the capital accumulation we're seeing since the Industrial Revolution is a response to the much greater efficiency of the modern economy. And so, and how big is that effect going to be, right? Will it explain all of modern capital accumulation? That's the question. And it turns out to estimate that, we'd have to know what does that curve look like. And as I say, there's a number of just astonishing simple facts that are true in economics. And here's another one that emerges. It turns out that that curve seems to be approximatable by the following function. Output per person is capital per person to the power A. And remember, A is the share of capital income in national income. And that number is typically going to be about a quarter. It just turns out there's no reason on God's earth why that relationship should turn out to actually represent the world, right? Because this relationship here depends on the physics of production, right? There are not a lot of physical constants in the world, right? But it turns out that to a rough approximation, this seems to describe the production possibilities in economies. There was a question here. A is the share of capital rentals in national income, right? So if we summed up all the payments that are going to the owners of capital, and remember, to do that in the actual economy, you have to go to every owner-occupied house, you have to go to everyone who has a car is a capital rental income receiver because there's an implicit rental for that car that you're getting, right? And so there's all these, if I'm the same payee and recipient of income, it doesn't show up in the tax system. So to do that, as I say, we have to go through and do this calculation. We'd actually find out that about a quarter of all income in the economy is coming from capital ownership. And then you get this relationship. Now, what does that look like? Hopefully, from high school math, you have a rough idea of what these relationships look like. But for example, one thing, if this was a half, this would say y equals k, the square root of capital, right? And that's why you get this nice kind of curved relationship. Because this is a quarter, the relationship is even more curved, right? It goes up more steeply and then it flattens out, right? If this was 1, it would be a straight line. So the further away A is from 1, the more it has this curved relationship, okay? But that roughly, since the Industrial Revolution, and even before the Industrial Revolution, seems to roughly describe how capital contributes to output in economies. And then there's going to be another missing term here, which is A, which is the level of efficiency of the economy, right? So that we're just holding constant. And so that actually is how these things seem to be related in practice, just empirically. That's how they're connected. If that's the case, then it's going to be the case that the marginal product of capital will actually equal A times AK to the A minus 1. That's taking a derivative, right? So don't worry about it, okay? Just trust me, right? Right? That can actually be rewritten as A times AK to the A all divided by K. Because this K, this minus 1 element here is just 1 over K. So that's what that thing equals. What is AK to the A? It's Y. And so the marginal product of capital is actually going to be this very simple relationship in modern economies. It's A, the share of capital in national income, multiplied by the ratio of output per unit of capital. Okay? And that's, there's going to be this very simple relationship. Now, what happens is that this thing here, if R is constant, what that is actually going to say is that since the Industrial Revolution, as efficiency advance has occurred, you're going to get this constancy of output per unit of capital. The capital output ratio, the inverse of that, is also going to remain constant, okay? And as I say, it's just a consequence of the fact that this relationship holds is going to be the case that at constant rates of return in the economy, it's also going to be the case that the amount of capital you need to produce a unit of output is actually also going to stay roughly constant since the Industrial Revolution. For that to stay constant, for the capital output ratio to stay constant, that implies that the growth rate of income has to be the same as the growth rate of the capital stock. And as I say, that actually turns out to be roughly the description of the world since the Industrial Revolution. I already mentioned that capital per person seems to be growing about the same rate as output per person. And so what this says is that, look, any advance in efficiency induces more capital investment because the rate of return on capital has stayed constant. Then, because of the nature of this relationship, the amount that induces is such that the rate of growth of output is the same as the rate of growth of the capital stock in modern economies. And consequently, efficiency advance on its own can actually explain all of the growth of the capital stock since the Industrial Revolution, because what we actually observe is that the capital stock is growing about as fast as output. Efficiency advance with a constant rate of return will induce exactly that amount of growth. And so it's actually the case that efficiency advance explains almost all growth of capital accumulation, physical capital accumulation, since the Industrial Revolution. And so what that actually takes, the last bit of mathematics here, and then I promise you. Yeah. Yes. So the question here was, what happens over time as economies grow? Does the marginal product of capital remain constant, or is it decreasing, right? Increasing. The important point here is that because the marginal product of capital is fixed to the interest rate, and because the interest rate hasn't changed since the Industrial Revolution, the marginal product of capital has remained constant in the modern world, okay? What would happen if you just had efficiency growth and didn't have any response in terms of the accumulation of capital would be that the marginal product of capital would rise, okay? But it can't do that because the markets wouldn't be in equilibrium then. So what actually happens is that any efficiency advance has to also be accompanied by an increase in the capital stock in order that that relationship can stay constant. And that in turn implies that the growth rate of capital will actually be as fast as the growth rate of income in modern economies. And we can explain most of the growth rate of capital as simply being the result of this upward shiftward of the production function. Okay? And what that in turn implies is that, look, we said all of growth can be reduced to this very simple function for modern economies, where there's these two contributors. There's the growth rate of capital multiplied by the share of capital. That explains about a quarter of growth because the growth rate of capital is about the same as the growth rate of income. And then there's the growth rate of efficiency. What we just showed, though, was that any change in the growth rate of efficiency actually is going to predict a change in the growth rate of the capital stock. This isn't truly an independent variable in this equation. It's actually dependent on the growth rate of efficiency and, in fact, on income. And so further, we actually showed that any growth in income will be accompanied by the growth rate of capital that's of an equivalent amount. And since this is actually a dependent variable in the equation, now we can actually replace it by the other variables it depends on, right? And so it turns out it's going to be tightly connected with the growth rate of income. And so this equation actually can be written as this. Capital just drops out as an independent term in the equation, right? It's only efficiency, and efficiency produces output. So we've got this relationship, and then we could simplify. We take this to the other side, and now we'll get the growth rate of output times 1 minus A equals the growth rate of efficiency. Or the growth rate of output is going to equal 1 over 1 minus A times the growth rate of efficiency. And so in this alternative account of modern growth just says the following. Something happened around 200 years ago where the efficiency rate of growth of efficiency increased dramatically. That growth of efficiency directly was going to increase output by the amount of the efficiency growth. But at the same time, that efficiency growth leads to all of these enhanced opportunities for capital investment in economies. And so it not only has a direct effect on growth, it also has an indirect effect by leading to capital accumulation. And we can measure the magnitude of that effect in this way. So it's going to be the growth rate of efficiency multiplied by 1 over 1 minus A. Since A is about a quarter, every 1% increase in efficiency will actually explain about a 1.33% increase in output. And so if efficiency grows at 1%, output will grow about 1.33%. Since the Industrial Revolution, in successful economies like the US, outputs tended to grow about 2% per person per year. That's all going to be traceable to the efficiency growth in the economy. Okay? And the problem is that that efficiency growth is very hard to attribute to very specific capital investments within the economy. Right? It's coming from some kind of human activity, but it seems impossible to actually reduce it to just an increased investment in various types of capital. Somehow we're learning all the time in modern economies, but it's very hard to reduce it to a capital accumulation process, right? And something happened to lead us on this path, but in a way that's very hard to explain as just, oh, the rate of return went down, and so then people invested more in capital, and there were all these spillovers from the capital, because early on the capital didn't seem to have these spillover effects. Suddenly, after 1800, it's having these, something's going on. Something is happening within economies. And so the fear of economists, this is to end up at the worst possible place where all of the success and prosperity of modern society, all of the difference between our society and, you know, one of the sad societies that are in the paper, the Times this morning at 5 a.m., you know, Guatemala, Haiti, Gambia, it's all down to this difference in efficiency within economies. But efficiency is this very mysterious variable, right? It's this bizarre thing that somehow we get to a point where every year we're somehow figuring out how to do things better within the economy, but in a way that's very hard to understand, right? It's very hard to understand why early economies, this process didn't occur. Our economy, it does. Why we have this, but, you know, Guatemala has very low levels of efficiency. And it all comes down to this. And as I say, the mystery of growth then is, can we understand what this efficiency variable is? Okay? And so that brings us then to the next kind of chapter in the book, which is to talk about, well, what are the basic theories of the Industrial Revolution? What are the basic theories of the onset of modern growth? And it turns out that these come in 3 varieties. Right? So if you want to understand, you know, almost all explanations, there are many, many explanations from the onset of modern growth, but they really can be classified in kind of 3 kind of groups. The first group is one which posits something called an exogenous shock. What's meant by that is exogenous means outside. So the idea is that something occurred outside the economic system that changed the potential for economic growth. The growth is actually going to be explained by some other event which is actually outside the early economy. The classic one that people want to posit is something to do with institutions. Somehow the institutions of the society changed, but in a way that's not in itself going to be explained by economic changes, right? That there was this shock from outside the economic system. A second one, we'll see when we look at the Industrial Revolution, is that the shock is something like the existence of huge deposits of coal in the British economy. And the idea here is going to be that earlier technologies made incremental advances, but somehow in one economy you had to have the right geology, where suddenly they stumbled upon a new technology which exploited fossil fuels in this new way and which just opened up the door to kind of unending economic growth. And that the crucial difference between India and China was between England and China was that in China they have lots of coal, but it's not where the people are. And it's hard to transport to where the people are. In England, they literally were sitting on coal in the north of England, right? And it's not just that they're sitting on coal. If you go to the coal fields in the northeast, the land goes like this, and then there's the North Sea here. The coal seams actually run under the ground like this. So in some parts, the coal is actually sitting on the surface, right? But also, under the water here, the coal seams, again, are exposed to the action of waves. And after storms in the northeast, it's still the case. Coal washes ashore. The beaches there are actually littered with coal. Until recently, there were people who made their living by going to the beaches in the northeast of England, still within the last 10 years, and scavenging the coal that the storms bring up, right? And so it was, if coal was the secret, the answer would be the British, God was literally throwing coal at the British and saying, try this. This may be useful, right? And so it really is the case that, there's this stuff, and what can you do with it? It shows up on the sands, and it turns out it burns, right? and it's just an amazing feature of the Northeast landscape, right? And so the argument would be that somehow this resource was available in Britain. It was there. I mean, in the Middle Ages, they knew about coal. It's actually called in Britain, coal was initially called sea coal, right? And so they knew about it, but what happened was that they didn't develop a technology that could use it efficiently, but once that technology came along, it then led to the onset of the modern age. And so again, that would be this kind of exogenous shock that, you happen to have this, and somehow you blundered on this. Another argument is that it's the Enlightenment. It's this intellectual movement that starts with the kind of the upper levels of the society, with the philosophers, with Voltaire and various other people, and that somehow changes people's attitudes, right? And so it's an intellectual movement. It's not explicable by the economic system, but it's coming from outside. Another one that I've mentioned is that it's a religious movement that sets in process modern growth. It turns out in the Industrial Revolution, a very large number of the innovators in Britain were Protestant, fundamentalist Protestants. And so the argument is that you had previous religious ideologies that emphasized acceptance, submission to God's will. Protestantism then comes along. It has a very different view of the relationship between man and God. It emphasizes action and works, and that's actually what then leads to the onset of growth, right? And it's just an accident that somehow this configuration came along in Europe. And so then people have looked at, for example, even now, people have said, well, is there something different about Islam as a religion that would account for the poverty of many Islamic nations in the modern world? Is there something about this kind of ideology in these different religions that emphasize this, right? And one of the important things, for example, is that in modern Islam, the Quran is still in Arabic. And so in madrasas in Pakistan, there are all of these children memorizing the Quran. They're memorizing the sounds, but they don't speak Arabic. So basically, they're memorizing something that's not accessible to them, right? In medieval Europe, under Catholic Church doctrine, the Bible had been translated from Greek into Latin. That was the text of the Mass. The ordinary people did not speak Latin. A lot of the priests actually did not know Latin either. They could mumble a few prayers, but they really didn't have access to this. And one of the crucial things that happens with the Reformation is this emphasis on the idea that people should be able to understand the religious texts that they're using, and that every person has their own responsibility to understand these texts. And so the argument would be that there's just a fundamental change in the religious doctrine, which has as its byproduct that now you have a lot of people who are acquiring literacy, who are changing their attitude to the world, who are taking responsibility, and that it then has this much wider effect in terms of the change within the society, right? Because another feature, remember, of growth in Europe is that initially it's concentrated in the more Protestant parts of Europe, right? And so it has this possibility that it really stems from some kind of initial religious ideology. So these are, as I say, so these are all kind of exogenous elements, right? They're not going to be explained within the economic system. The problem is going to be, well, why didn't that happen till 100,000 years after people are wandering around on the savannah, right? You know, because if it's an exogenous shock, why would you wait so long for this shock to appear, right? Why in ancient Rome didn't, you know, a bunch of people appear who said, you know, well, everyone has to be, you know, personally responsible on their relationship to the gods, right? And so that, you know, you have to understand the text, or, you know, again, if it's to do with the Enlightenment, why didn't other societies accidentally have these Enlightenment moments, right? So in some sense, it pushes the problem of the Industrial Revolution back a stage. But it's actually saying that eventually, in many of these explanations, it's going to be a non-economic explanation, right? It's actually going to fall outside the economic system. A second type of explanation that we're going to look at is something that's called a multiple equilibrium. And so the idea in that type of explanation is that each society provides certain incentives to people to act. The world was stuck without economic growth because the economic system of the earlier world, in part because the Malthusian mechanism was keeping incomes very low within this society compared to the modern world, provided a set of incentives that really did not induce people to invest a lot in technological advance or to think a lot about changing the technique. And that there was some modest shock which came to the system in England in the 18th century, which somehow changed these incentives. And then once these incentives were changed, we were now in a world where the incentives are just very different. And the argument simply would say, again, if we go to poor societies now, say in Africa, it could be that people are doing the best they can within the framework they're living in, but the incentives that that society provides are just such that it does not favor economic growth, right? And so this idea would say that everyone's rational in these societies. They're rational before and after the Industrial Revolution. They're equally motivated by the desire for economic advance. But somehow, in the Malthusian era, societies were caught in a trap. It's a Malthusian trap that provides very poor incentives in terms of the inducements towards economic growth. And then accidentally, one society experienced a shock which then pushed it towards economic growth. And it could be a relatively modest shock that actually led it towards growth. One of the big ideas that people have in terms of this is connected with human capital and with education. And so the idea here is that in all societies before 1800, people had an inducement to have many children and supply them with very little education. In modern society, people have an inducement because of our incentives to have fewer children and supply them with lots of education. And it's that change in the inputs to children, right, that actually represents the move towards the modern world, right? Because we see globally now, if we look across societies, that high-income societies tend to have very modest numbers of children. What it means, by the way, is that high-income societies have so few children that if you were to project the future of the world, you would say, well, no Japanese will exist in, 1,000 years. It's gone, right? Italians, well, wipe them out, right? That fertility levels have dropped so low in many modern societies, and that now economies are having to grapple with this problem. What happens when we're all old? Right? And there are almost no young people. But the idea is that somehow that's just the incentives of the economic system shifted between one where you had lots of kids, you didn't put any investment in, consequently they're not very well equipped to deal with economic challenges, and somehow that changed. And so one of the things we want to look at in the Industrial Revolution period is that really kind of an element of the process here, right? Do you get this very important fertility transition? Is that triggering the onset of the Industrial Revolution, and was there some signal that families got? Did relative prices change? Now, one thing could happen is suddenly the reward for skill starts increasing in the economy, and people say, well, our kid to make it, we need to give them all this education. We're going to have to reduce the number of children we have. Okay, and so that's a kind of multiple equilibrium argument. Another idea that is very popular now is that technological advance the argument is, will be induced by relative prices. When people look at what kind of new technologies they want to introduce, they tend to be guided by, well, what's expensive and what's cheap, right? You want to get a technology that uses cheap inputs and dispenses with expensive inputs. So now, with the rise in gas prices recently, there's a lot of attention to technologies that somehow can economize on gas, right? When gas is very cheap, then you think, well, we'll develop technologies that deliver other comforts, right? You want giant cars that deliver, you can have a living room that you can travel around in, not just a car, right? Now, actually, in American society, there's this idea that the ghost in the machine, right? Which is the people now clad in these metal exteriors, right? Move from one location to another. Where now you can eat, you can watch TV. Now when you're on the highway, you see the people watching TV as they're driving along. You're completely encased. You're returning to the womb of the car, right? And you move from your house to your car, to your drive-in bank, to your drive-in food place, to your drive-in latte, right? And now, you just live completely within this vehicle, right? And so that'll be, eventually we can maybe just dispense with houses completely, and we'll just make everything mobile, right? And we'll just all congregate at various locations in the desert at times of the year. And so the argument then is, well, that's something that's induced by the incredibly cheap price of energy in the modern world. But if energy becomes much more expensive, then we'll explore a different set of technologies. And so one of the characteristics people say about the Industrial Revolution is that it economizes on labor. Machines replace people. Output per worker can correspondingly rise enormously because of this switch towards machines that replace people. What's going to induce that switch is, are people expensive in the production process? If people are incredibly cheap, then you don't tend to look at a lot of technologies that replace people. You tend to look at, say, economies that replace energy, right? And so if in the early world, what's really expensive are raw materials and energy, and because of this Malthusian mechanism, people are dirt cheap, then a lot of the technological advances before then could have been in the direction of replacing energy or raw materials. But somehow, what one of the characteristics of Britain in the Industrial Revolution period, it's a high-wage economy. For the Malthusian era, it's a high-wage economy, and it also turns out to be an economy where capital is cheap. So it has this odd combination of both high-wage, and we saw that in earlier societies, capital was very expensive. And so, and also wages tend to be quite low in Asia, right? Capital tends to be very expensive. And so the argument's been made, it was just that peculiar configuration in Britain that led people for the first time to start thinking systematically about, well, how do we dispense with labor in production processes? And once they started looking, it turns out that that was an incredibly fruitful area of technological advance. And so that led to a new equilibrium where systematically you spend all your time wondering about how do we get rid of labor. And labor then gets more and more expensive. And so consequently you spend more and more time thinking about how to get rid of it. And it turns out that that's just it's a feature of the physics of the world that's really fruitful area of advance. Okay? And so these are kind of multiple equilibria explanations then that said, well, the reason you don't get this growth beforehand is you just never hit that particular configuration of prices, right? And so it's just an accident of Britain's characteristics. And so there's no difference in the inherent inventiveness of the Chinese or the Japanese or the British. It's just that in Japan and China, labor was cheap, capital was expensive. In Britain, labor is expensive and capital is cheap. Okay? Now, as I say, the problem with the multiple equilibria explanation, one of them is going to be, it still requires some kind of shock, some kind of exogenous shock. And if that shock is going to be a very small one, right, then the problem is that then why don't you get that configuration sometime earlier? Right? If we look back at, say, ancient Greece, we saw, hey, labor seemed to be very expensive in ancient Greece. So why weren't they developing labor-replacing machines, right? Now, it turns out capital is more expensive in Greece, right? But you wonder about why wouldn't you have hit that configuration at some other point in some other place? By the way, if you really think that that's what matters, then around about 1800, the society with actually probably the highest wages in the world is actually the United States. Already by 1800, the evidence is that wages in the United States are probably about double what those were in Britain. And so if you really wanted an industrial revolution actually based on relative prices, then one of the plausible places actually would have been the United States, because it was a frontier society that you hadn't occupied all the land yet, wages actually could rise. It wasn't constrained by the Malthusian mechanism. Wages are very high in the early United States. Okay? So the multiple equilibrium explanation, the problem is actually it's going to be, if it's a small shock that you're required to do this, then you've got so many different societies to play with in the past, you think that you would have hit one of them before that got the right configuration. If it's a large shock, then in some sense, you're really going back to this exogenous shock explanation, and then you've got to worry about, well, why is it only then that you get this particular large shock in relative prices? Okay? The third type of explanation is something that people call endogenous growth. Endogenous. What's the idea here? The idea is that there must be, the economy is following a path. That you're starting off in a particular state, and there's an evolution taking place. And the reason the Industrial Revolution only occurred around about 1800 in Britain was that there had to be enough internal economic adjustment in this long previous period to actually trigger then the conditions that were necessary for the Industrial Revolution. That if you actually knew everything, right, that eventually, 500 years from now, some complete historian will be able to say, starting at 100,000 BC, our model can correctly predict that the Industrial Revolution, at least with very high probability, would occur around about 1800, right? That what was going to happen is that things had been set in motion, right? So it's just like, you know, people giving an account of the history of the universe. There's the Big Bang, right? There then follows stellar and galactic evolution, right? Eventually we get to the place we are, and if we have a complete understanding of the physics of the universe, then within a certain might just be there's a probability distribution, but we can explain why our world was at least a probable outcome of this earlier set of events. And so again, a complete explanation in this model would say there's some process that's actually occurring in this earlier economic system that is eventually going to induce an industrial revolution. We might be a little dubious. We might be 1,000 years out in terms of locating it. We might miss in terms of which country it is, right? There might be other countries that were equally or even more plausibly going to be the recipients of this industrial revolution. But if we correctly understand the history, we would see that there's a dynamic in the pre-industrial world that's changing where we're headed to. This type of growth, by the way, is, again, this is what economists want to produce. This is the desiderata, desideratum, that all economists are aiming for. And again, the person who could produce such a convincing account, Nobel Prize, right? It's available. It's on offer, right? And it's now about $1 million, okay? Plus side benefits. And how's that going to proceed, though? And the problem here is that I emphasize that the Malthusian mechanism is keeping a lot of economic variables the same. It's keeping net fertility the same. It's keeping wages are not changing. Output per person is not changing. So the Malthusian world is this world of stasis. So how do you get this break from that world into the modern world? There has to be some state variable, some condition about the world that's actually evolving over time. And the one that people have, first of all, looked at is N. It's the number of people that are in the world. Because that's a variable that changed enormously between the very earliest days and the eve of the Industrial Revolution. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, we've moved up to a world of about 800 million people. We started off at 100,000 BC with maybe 10,000 people, right? And so you've had this enormous change in the stock of people in the world. And so one of the ideas that people, a lot of these models have played with, because one of the few things that systematically changes and it's going in the right direction is it just the number of people in the world that eventually produced modern growth? And the simple idea here is that each person has some random possibility of having talent and ingenuity. In a world of 10,000 people, we're not going to find a lot of very talented people. Consequently, technologies are going to evolve very, very slowly. But once we produce 800 million people, then the possibilities just expand, right? The numbers of people who are available, who are thinking about stuff. And the point is, any discovery can be shared with everyone. The nature of knowledge is that it's this free good, right? And so we expand the possibilities of growth enormously just by expanding the stock of people. Now, there's going to be a problem, it turns out, in terms of this just as a category of explanation, because one thing that kind of seems to point to is China. Where are the people? They're in China, right? China is going to be the locus. If China was ahead already by 1400, it had built up this huge stock of population, it would be the 800-pound gorilla in terms of economic growth, right? It would just have this crushing advantage. What's the characteristic of Britain in the Industrial Revolution period? It's tiny, right? There's only, about 1700, there's only 6 million people in England, right? In China, you're dealing with 400, 500 million people. It would seem that it would point to growth as having to occur in the East, right? The way that this argument has been justified is to say it's absolutely the case that big places tend to be more advanced than small places, right? So that when they set out on the voyages of exploration in the 16th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, when you arrive at these little remote islands, you don't find advanced technologies. You find people with much poorer technologies, and the argument simply is, well, it's because we have this huge stock of people we can draw on, and you've got 500 people. You're not going to produce, an advanced technology. And so, and again, the argument's made, well, that's why the locus of economic growth was always Eurasia. It's because that's where all the people are, and it also, in Diamond's argument, it's because it's a society where you can share technology across the different parts of Eurasia. China grows wheat. Europeans grow wheat. Advances in the Middle East, they grow wheat. Advances in the technology in one place are very useful in other places, right? Whereas the argument in Diamond's book is that in South America, the problem is the people in Argentina and the people in North Dakota face similar production issues, but they're separated by people who have absolutely no interest in the plains growth of wheat, right? And so that you can't benefit from the fact that you're on the same continent as these other people, right? Similarly, in Africa, the argument is that you're going to get these very different environments that are not in communication with each other. And so the argument then has been that, well, size matters, and it's just a function of waiting for this size to get big enough. There's another issue here, though, which is that even if size matters, it should matter in a relatively continuous way. It would seem to predict a very smooth transition, right, from early societies to later societies, where gradually, very, very gradually, the rate of growth keeps increasing. Okay? The huge problem for all explanations of the Industrial Revolution is its apparent suddenness, right? Because endogenous growth explanations are actually inherently going to be ones where it's going to be hard to produce this shock, right? This transformation. It's going to be a more gradual movement, escape from one society to the other. What in the book here is actually we're going to have a kind of a variant of endogenous growth, because what the book is going to argue is it's not the number of people that's changing, it's the nature of people, that the Malthusian mechanism is actually changing the human agent, right? And that's why it takes a long time to get to economic growth, because it takes a long time for that change to occur. But also that change was occurring somewhat more rapidly in some societies than others as a consequence of their demography, right? and that it's a cultural and maybe even a genetic change that's going on in people that eventually ushers in modern growth. That we were transformed by the Malthusian era, and we're different than the people of 100,000 years ago, and that's why there really is this endogenous element to growth. But there's still going to be large and kind of accidental elements to exactly when this transformation occurred. We might not be able to explain exactly that, but we can explain at least why it was becoming more and more likely that we would have this kind of transformation, okay? And so these are essentially the competing explanations, right? What's the advantage of an exogenous shock? Well, it can fit with the relative apparent suddenness of the Industrial Revolution. What's the advantage of multiple equilibria? Again, it can fit with the idea that this is a relatively sudden change. What's the disadvantage of these two explanations is, in some sense, it just pushes everything back one step, right? It just says, now we have an intermediate variable we have to look at, but then you're going to have an account of, well, why did you have an enlightenment in Europe but not in China, right? What were the difference in conditions, right? But in some sense, in the case of these exogenous shocks, it pushes it into the realm of politics or culture or intellectual life and says, you know, it's not really an economic problem, right? The idea of multiple equilibria is to say it's still an economic problem, but it's just some configuration of prices or other conditions that lead people to behave in a certain way, right? So that keeps it within economics. And this, again, is going to try and keep it within economics, right? And so there are these kind of disadvantages, advantages to these various accounts. Now, the most popular idea in terms of an exogenous shock is going to be that it's an institutional change that spurs the Industrial Revolution. I'll stop now, but what I'll do is, so read, I think we're at chapter 11. And so on Wednesday of next week, we'll start and talk about, well, is it going to be some kind of institutional shock that really is going to lie at the heart of the Industrial Revolution? Is that a possible explanation? Enjoy your weekend, have fun, and see you on Wednesday.